Welcome to another episode of Keep It Electric. I am your host, Tremayne Person. This is episode 70. And let's be honest, if you're a Mariners fan, this offseason has been an exercise in patience, maybe just frustration. Every morning, we're checking the headlines, we're hoping for some kind of splash, and instead we get the baseball equivalent of watching paint dry. But there's still plenty to talk about. It's 2:15 on Thursday. This episode would be available on Friday, and not directly related to the topic. I'd normally jump right into Around the League, and I will, but my phone just goes off and Max Scherzer signed a one-year deal, $15.5 million contract to the Blue Jays. This doesn't directly affect one of my topics, but it's something that might actually be important based off of what I plan to talk about today. So, 1 year, $15.5 million from Max Scherzer for Toronto. That's, they need pitching. This seems like a flyer move, a $15 million flyer. But Mad Max has still got it. So, let's see if that works out for them. Regardless, we have a ton of moves between the last few days around the league. I won't be covering all those moves. I'm just going to talk about a couple of the notable moves. The Mets, they made a smart bullpen move. The Dodgers continuing to, assemble their Infinity Stones. They have infinite money. So we're going to talk about that strategy. A couple of Mariners trade proposals that have came out this week by radio hosts or writers. We're going to talk about those a little bit. And we're also going to talk about the never-ending mystery that is T-Mobile Park. So, let's jump in. All right, so around the league, the Mets are bringing back a familiar face. That's veteran right-hander and ex-Mariner Ryan Stanek. He's staying put for a one-year deal. For the Mets, this move isn't really about regular season dominance. It's about having an arm when the games matter most. So let's rewind that a little bit. Stanek was a key bullpen weapon for the Astros before bouncing around last year. First, he stopped in Seattle, and then he went to New York. His regular season numbers, they weren't jaw-dropping. ERA over 6 in 17 games for the Mets. I think his ERA was just under 5 with the Mariners. But when the postseason lights came on, Stanek, he, turned back the clock a little bit. So he stepped up big time. The Mets saw firsthand what he can do under pressure. So they're betting on that playoff arm to be a difference maker again in 2025. And that's what the signing is really about. He had some bumps in the regular season, but when the stakes were high, he delivered. And with the Mets eyeing on another deep playoff push, they're making sure that they have an arm ready to handle those big moments. Kirby Yates, yeah, this is, we're going to be talking about the Dodgers so much on here. The Dodgers, they just can't help themselves. This time they decided to, they didn't have enough bullpen firepower, so they spent $13 million on a 37-year-old Kirby Yates. He had a ridiculous season last year. He was a monster, 1.17 ERA, 85 strikeouts, 61 innings. I don't know if there's really ever a doubt that the Dodgers would swoop in and add him to their never-ending collection of bullpen arms. But just in case, they have the money, so why not? So let's not forget they've added Tanner Scott. They've also re-signed Michael Kopech as well. So it's almost like the Dodgers are assembling a Marvel movie cast. That's in their starting pitching rotation, that's in their bullpen, and that's in their batting lineup. If you want to take inventory, that also includes Roki Sasaki, Michael Conforto, Blake Snell, Teoscar Hernandez, and Tommy Edman, who they also have signed for another 4 years. I mean, their signings this offseason have been ridiculous to an already ridiculous roster. If you're a Dodgers fan, you're loving every second of this. If you're anyone else, I'm sure you're just along for the ride with me. The rich just keep getting richer. The rest of us are just wondering how anyone is supposed to compete with this endless supply of resources. Ha-Seong Kim signed a 2-year, $29 million deal with the Tampa Bay Rays. let's be clear, Kim isn't even ready to jump into their lineup right away. He's still recovering from an injury. Latest I've heard, he'll be ready late April, maybe early May. Despite all that, this signing is a little different because there was a lot of noise, a lot of speculation about whether the Mariners should go after him. If you've been listening to Keep It Electric for a while, you already know where I stand on this. I was 100% against it then, and I'm still against it now. And honestly, I'm glad that Tampa Bay got him and this is over with. And I get it. There's some frustration in the Mariners fan base and even among certain pockets of the management. You know, community-wise, we did make a move, especially since $29 million over 2 years is well within our financial budget. But I stress to say, don't stress. Like, seriously, don't stress about it. This was never a move that made sense, in my opinion, for Seattle. If we brought in Kim, it would have been for a single season at the most because we already have Cole Young waiting in the wings. We have other internal prospects. Not to mention, like, we're excited about those internal infield prospects. So those guys, I think, can make an impact very soon at second base. Why go out and spend on a player who would just create a logjam for the talent that we have coming up? So bottom line, Kim to the Mariners to me was never the right fit. We're better off without him. Let Tampa handle that. All right, so before we jump into the Mariners portion of the podcast, I'm just going to touch on a quick few housekeeping notes. First off, if you're looking for even more content beyond what I cover here, make sure to check out keepitelectricpod.com. There you'll find exclusive articles that fuel a lot of discussions I have on this show, plus some topics that I don't have the chance to cover. So if you want to go deeper, visit keepitelectricpod.com. If you want to stay connected and be a part of the conversation, follow me on Instagram at keepitelectric, on X at the Electric Pod. Whichever platform is your go-to, I'm there. And if you ever want to reach out directly, you can always hit me up there or through the contact form on the website. Lastly, if you like what you're hearing, please take a moment and leave a positive review. It really goes a long way. It helps more people find the show, keeps us growing, and lets me keep bringing you Mariners content every week. So with that out of the way, let's get into the latest Mariners news. All right, so let's talk about one of the more blink and you missed it transactions of the offseason. And what I mean by that is, like, if there are some Mariners fans out there who doesn't pay attention to the offseason and you're talking to them in the regular season, they would have had no idea that this move even happened. The Mariners, if you remember, they picked up Tyler J off of waivers, a move at the time that seemed like a low-risk bullpen depth kind of play. And then before he could get too comfortable with the idea, he was gone. We DFA'd him just days after that. We DFA'd him when we acquired Will Klein. So my thought was that it was simple. Seattle probably figured Jay would clear waivers and they would stash him in AAA. I think I kind of said something towards that happening in one of the most recent episodes. Jay apparently had other plans. He didn't want to stick around. He elected free agency. So he's looking for a team that could offer him a clearer shot in the big leagues. It makes sense. For those unfamiliar, Jay was kind of a big deal in 2015. He was a 6th overall pick by the Twins. He had stuff to be a starter, maybe even a high leverage arm, but he was plagued with injuries that threw a wrench into his development, and he never quite lived up to those expectations. Could he carve out a role in Seattle as a left-handed specialist with a low 90s fastball? Possibly, but we already have one of those, right? So Seattle's bullpen is stacked with power righties. Jay never really felt like a natural fit in the mix, so it's probably going to work out better for him to find another team. So let's set the record straight on this trade proposal. I'm diving into the trade proposal rounds. This one came from Ryan Divish of the Seattle Times. You guys have probably heard of him. He highlighted a trade scenario that's not likely going to happen, but really frames the position that the Mariners are in right now. It's an example of what the Mariners would realistically have to give up if they wanted to make meaningful additions to the roster. So before we all jump to conclusions, and I'm one who doesn't usually entertain stuff like this, but this has been super interesting for me. Let's break down what it really is. It's a reflection of how tough the trade market has become for Seattle. So the deal on the table presented by Ryan Divish was the Mariners would send top catching prospect Harry Ford, infielder Michael Arroyo, and another prospect to the Marlins. In return, the Mariners would get Brendan Donovan from the Cardinals, while the Marlins would receive those prospects, and the Cardinals would pick up right-handed pitcher Edward Cabrera from Miami. So, let's talk about why this isn't happening. For starters, giving up Ford and Arroyo for an extra piece for Donovan, I think that price is too steep. Donovan is a versatile player, but he averages 10 home runs a year, and he's been hitting in hitter-friendly St. Louis. So if you're a Mariners fan hoping for a big offensive upgrade, you're not getting that with him. Now, from the Cardinals' perspective, they need pitching, so this would probably work out. But the Cardinals also aren't desperate to move on from Donovan. He's under team control. The Cardinals shouldn't be pressed to move him until 26 or 27. So where it gets tricky, and I brought this up because this part is super fascinating to me. I never really gave it much thought that the expansion of the 12-team playoff format, it's changed the way all these teams are approaching building their rosters. So when you think about it, we've seen the 2023 Rangers, the 2023 Diamondbacks, and even last year, the 2024 Royals. We're seeing the Reds flip into a team that's worthy of playoff contention. So that's exactly why a third team is being thrown into a trade scenario. Because in today's MLB, most teams aren't eager to trade away proven talent for prospects. So the Mariners have all these riches of prospects, and a lot of the other teams, they just don't really care. So what does that mean for them? It means that their options are limited. They're stuck trying to build a better roster without mortgaging too much of their farm, but they also don't want to spend big in free agency. It's a tightrope act, and right now they're left searching for creative ways to make meaningful additions, and that's why we're dealing with all of this inactivity. So when trades like this pop up, it's not because they're likely, but it's because they illustrate just how much Seattle would have to give up to land an impact player. And Brendan Donovan, to me, he's not it. The next proposal comes from Mike Salk of the Seattle Sports. His thoughts were actually brilliant and still rather unlikely. He suggested that we trade Luis Castillo for Bo Bichette, a 1-for-1 trade, which I think is great. Now, given the way this podcast started, when I wanted to talk about this, it sounded perfect before the Blue Jays signed Max Scherzer, which we know now they just did. So this trade is unlikely at this point, but on paper, I think there's a lot of logic with what he was saying. The Mariners desperately need an impact bat. Bichette, they would be cashing in on Bichette possibly having a comeback season while also shedding a little bit of payroll. The next move he proposed was Pete Alonso. And I think we all still love the idea of having Pete Alonso in the middle of the lineup. The market has been actually pretty quiet for him. He's still having those issues with the Mets. It looks like the deal that might get it done is 3 years, $70 million with opt-outs. Now, I think the real question is, why would Alonso? He's a guy who's made a living off of crushing home runs. Don't get me wrong, he can hit in T-Mobile Park, but why would he sign up to have half of his games in one of the most, if not the most, power-suppressing ballpark in baseball? I mean, you're telling me that teams like the Cubs, Red Sox, or the Mets, first of all, they can offer him more money. Second of all, they have a much more enticing ballpark for him to hit in. And then the last part of this trio of blockbuster moves would be getting rid of the Mitches, but I think we've talked about this one before. You got to get a team that's able to, or you have to add probably a prospect in to have a team take on $17.75 million from a guy like Mitch Haniger. Garver, his trade value sucks too, but if the Mariners were able to move away from either one of them, Garver would be most likely be the one they would move away from. So let's add it all up. The Mariners convinced the Blue Jays to part with their franchise shortstop in a 1-for-1 swap. The Mariners somehow lure Alonso to a place where home runs go to die, and magically you find a way to dump Haniger or Garver without eating a bunch of money. That's a lot of things that they need to go right. And at the beginning of the offseason, this stuff could have made sense. But at this point, if you believe all that stuff could happen, I've got a bridge to sell you. And I get it. This team feels stuck in the same cycle, just good enough to compete, but not quite good enough to break through. And all we want to see is them take a big swing. But moves like this, they're fun for radio. And the reality is, the Mariners front office, it just doesn't operate this way. All right, so this next segment, I gotta admit, my bad. I've been putting it off for a couple weeks. I said I was going to break down the AL West, talk about some of their offseason moves and what that means for the Mariners. So I'm going to do that right now. So let's start with the Astros. They signed Christian Walker. They traded away Kyle Tucker, traded him to the Cubs for third baseman Isaac Paredes, and the Cubs' first round pick, third baseman Cam Smith. High upside. They drafted him last season. The Angels, to me, what they've done is a little concerning, to say the least. They spent $80 million in free agency for one. With that, they signed Yusei Kikuchi, Kyle Hendricks, Travis Darnold, Kevin Newman. They also traded Griffin Canning to the Braves for Jorge Soler. And then, not to mention, they signed Tim Anderson to a minor league deal last week. I don't know if this is just a year of patchwork solutions. I do think Ron Washington has a plan. I don't know if this fixes their pitching either, but only time's going to tell. The Athletics, we don't say this one often, but they actually spent money. That started with Luis Severino, 3-year deal, $67 million. They also brought in TJ McFarland for bullpen depth, and they also brought in Gio Urshela for real cheap, $2.15 million. They traded with the Rays. They landed Jeffrey Springs and Jacob Lopez. And then they also locked up Brent Rooker for 5 years, $60 million extension. Brent Rooker was a huge bright spot last year, and now he's going to be in the outfield, teamed up with Lawrence Butler, who's got a ton of upside. In total, the A's spent $67 million, which for them might as well be $1 billion. But it's a sign that they're actually trying. And then we have the Rangers. They brought back Nathan Eovaldi, 3 years, $75 million. They also added Jock Peterson for more pop. Kyle Higashioka. I don't think I butchered that, but excuse me if I did. They also acquired Chris Martin and Hobie Milner, and then they traded for Jake Berger from the Marlins. Got a ton of power there, moving on from Nathaniel Lowe. And then they sent him to the Nationals for Robert Garcia. So overall, Texas is doing what good teams do. They're getting better without overhauling too much, changing too much of what already works. I actually think, health permitted, that the Texas Rangers will be pretty dangerous this season. And then we talk about the Mariners, who signed Donovan Solano. Oh, and they acquired Austin Shinton and some other arms. But, Solano, he's a fine player, even though it turns out we won't really be deploying him often. He's versatile. He's a veteran. He's a good clubhouse guy. But when every other team in the division is making real moves and you respond with a signing like this, honestly, everyone has the right to be frustrated. So after looking at these moves, the Astros are transitioning, but they still seem dangerous, especially if the young talent that they already have step up. They're still going to be in the mix. The Angels, they made a ton of moves, but what do they actually work? We've seen this before and it hasn't really gone well. So, and then we also don't know if Mike Trout's going to be healthy. The A's are spending, kind of. Clearly, they're setting up for Vegas, but the real question is, does it mean anything long term? The Rangers are circling back and looking for another title. They look ready to take the division again. And then the Mariners are left still waiting. So, are you buying into the AL offseason strategy? Look, I'm not making my official picks yet. That'll come at the end of spring training. But as things stand right now, the Rangers, if they stay healthy, could very well be the frontrunners for the AL West division. I hate that I'm saying that. Meanwhile, the Astros and the Mariners look like they'll be battling it out for second base. The Angels look like they've positioned themselves with potential to leapfrog the A's, but that all depends on whether their offseason moves actually translate into wins. And one thing's for sure, I personally think the division is wide open. It's actually going to be really hard to make a selection out of them that's not biased. The A's aren't really rolling over anymore. They doubled down on Brent Rooker. Lawrence Butler looks promising, and they're finally starting to spend money. So I don't think they're going to be contenders. I don't think we're looking at that. But if things go their way, they could be a 500 team. And that means no series is going to be a walk in the park for the Mariners. It wasn't last year. It's going to be far from that this year. At the same time, nothing in this division is predictable. The Astros, as they stand right now, they're gettable, but they're not forgettable. We've counted them out before, and we know how that goes. The reality is, anybody could take this division, in my opinion. It's up for grabs, and that's going to make this one hell of a season. All right, so a big topic this week is the enigma that is T-Mobile Park. I've talked about it before. There's an article that came out on MLB.com that really put the mystery under a microscope. Now, we all know Seattle has been a pitcher's paradise. It remains that way. It's a hitter's nightmare. But this article really does dive deeper into what's really going on and finally confirming that it's more than just the batter's eye and the player's opinion of the batter's eye. Now, we've all heard about the players complain about the visibility at the plate. Some actually like it. I mean, the ones that like it are few and far between, but some actually do. But there's been enough science behind it that it's not just that. It's also the weather. Dylan Moore, the quote on Dylan Moore, I think was extremely helpful. Him talking about the cold weather, him talking about how on the field, it really only feels warm for a couple months out of the year. So the ball is really only flying for a small portion of the year. The science and the data really backs it up. The Mariners hitters perform better on the road. I know I've taken a notice of that. Their pitchers absolutely dominate at home. Even a rotation as talented as Seattle's, they get a little extra juice when they're pitching at T-Mobile. And it's been debunked, or no, excuse me, I don't know if debunked is the word I want to use, but basically it's been proven that a consistent tailwind fuels the fastballs. And it's not like these guys can't pitch anywhere else. They can, and they're still strong on the road. But at home, they are a complete nightmare to opposing hitters. So how do you build a team to thrive in these conditions? I think that's exactly what we're looking at right now. And I think that's why the inactivity and why the front office is leaning so hard on what we have right now and the internal reserves is because they believe that they finally figured this thing out. And I believe them, but we also kind of have to. So the Mariners have figured out that line drives, contact, and up the middle approach is the best recipe for winning. So forget the traditional home run hunting sluggers. They've been hunting for those for years. Edgar Martinez helped establish this philosophy, and Jerry Dipoto is doubling down on it. Instead of trying to fight the park, the Mariners are going to start leaning into it. And then there's a rotation full of guys who can throw up absolute gas. That's Logan Gilbert, of course, being the outlier because he mixes up his arsenal more evenly. But there's a reason so many Mariners pitchers are working on dominant splitters as well. The combination of high velocity heaters and movement friendly conditions, it makes the pitching staff downright lethal. This is all not a coincidence. It's all by design. So the bottom line here, The Mariners finally seem to have cracked the code on how to build a roster that works in Seattle. They have a blueprint, it's there now. Now they just need a few more pieces to complete it. Could this philosophy be the key to long-term success? I think that's the million-dollar question, and I think that's why we're going to lean onto the roster that we have right now to kind of see if that works. So I would definitely, I hate to say it, I would call 2025 an experimental year for the Mariners to see if they figured this thing out. And then maybe going forward, we'll see what this roster really looks like. So that will wrap up this episode. Again, thank you for tuning in. Until next time, go Mariners.